Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much indeed for giving me the opportunity to present at the conference. I've been working with the Professor Tsai for a couple of years now, sort of in terms of defining these things, and I think the technology is beginning to mature, but also so are some of the discussions and debates, which I think Martin sort of referred to before. And I sit on a number of committees and groups which are considering these issues as we speak. So this first slide is really sort of to set the scene, and it was Professor Tsai. I have to say thank you to him for sort of originally explaining this all to me. That what we're talking about today is evolution, not revolution. Certainly, when I started in the world of computers, we had computers were big machines which were stored in discrete offices. And the way in which we communicated between computers was to pass around punch cards, to pass around tapes, and to pass around floppy disks. This was replaced, if you like, during the early 1980s with a more centralized model. But of course, what we're now beginning to do is to begin to go back to that distributed model once again. The time of having a very centralized model, sort of with centralized processes, I think is beginning to wane, and the thing that's enabling that fundamentally is cloud. Cloud is ubiquitous. It has global coverage now. It has a low cost of sharing data, and it's on demand. It allows you to do many things which would have been very difficult with the limited bandwidth, highly centralized computing models of the past. And as we've seen cloud begin to become ubiquitous, so with it, so data has become increasingly standardized. So again, a lot of the data, for example, in the financial world that we pass around, is really optimized towards copper wires. It's the X25 networks, which ran the world in the 1990s, where I would have a currency pair code which had 6 letters in it, and then sort of some other descriptor in it, which was about all that we could get through a copper wire in order to have high frequency trading, for example. And I worked for Reuters, and that was very much the model. And at that time, we had some debates about sort of whether we could move to XML, but XML was deemed to be far too heavy from a network point of view, and therefore wasn't seen to be very useful. But of course, the result of that is the data that we could share in those days was very, very small. So with today's fiber optic networks, the amount of data that we can share is vast. I think one strand of a fiber optic cable can carry 5 times the amount of data which is currently traded in the market today. So we've got huge amounts of growth that we can sort of go through, even without models like Netflix and so on taking up bandwidth. So the financial world is increasingly moved towards this standardized data model. Swift, for example, is moving to XML through ISO 20022. There's increasing use of APIs to share data, so between different applications and different systems. And those will basically mean that the data will become sort of much, much easier to use and much easier to manipulate through multiple applications. So instead of optimizing data to an application, the application will be able to absorb and consume data and to use that data for different purposes in different ways across the world. And of course, to be able to manipulate, we have to have those applications. Those applications could be smart contracts, as the professor spoke about, or they could be specific applications like Facebook or some of the other sort of trading applications, etc., which are there. But whatever way you think about it, I think the major change now is that the applications are the way in which you access data and use data and record data, and they are the main way in which you can then use that data and add value to that data, which is ultimately what this is all about. But to be able to do that, of course, you've got to have identity established. I can't contract with you, I can't trade with you unless I know who you are. And because of know your customer in the financial world, because of anti-money laundering rules, etc., identity is key. So I need to know who you are, I need to know your mobile phone number, I need to know your email address, I need to know where you reside. I need to know which companies you're connected with. All this information needs to be there in order to be able to satisfy regulatory and other constraints. So suddenly identity is no longer I'm Bob Blower. Identity is a whole series of pieces of information around Bob Blower, which then sort of establishes another level of trust, a different level of trust. So it's no longer a technical trust, it's also a logical trust that sort of then establishes it. And of course, this goes back to contract law, where in contract law, you need to have a legal identity in order to enter into a contract with another person or another company, and that legal establishment, can be restricted. So, for example, in bankruptcy, it can be restricted in terms of court jurisdiction and legal restrictions, etc. And those things are not yet available, if you like, in the digital world. In the digital world, we're not yet in a position where we can say, if there's a court order, that court order can take effect upon somebody's identity. I know there are some discussions in China around restricting, for example, tokens and particularly time restricting tokens to be basically sort of grant authority for particular time periods. But that's not yet sort of something which is being talked about globally, and certainly not from a legal perspective. But it's a very important thing because let's say I'm transacting with you, and let's say that somebody has a legal problem with me, they could potentially get a legal process against me, which would prevent me from sending you my side of the bargain, while you still send me your side of the bargain. And that sort of potentially could cause loss in the financial way to one or other of us. So these sort of issues need to be resolved in legal terms before we can sort of have a fully fledged trust relationship. Because I don't know where you might be subject to legal proceedings. It could be Venezuela, it could be America, it could be sort of the Cayman Islands. We need to have that sort of level of understanding around identity in order to be able to be fully trustworthy. Whoops. Thank you. Sorry about this. It's managed to. Yeah, sorry, go. Sorry about that. Having said that, tokens and coins on a distributed ledger are, to me, a lot like the coins of old. In China, the emperors would sort of create coins out of gold, same as in England. Those coins would be effectively transferred to barons or whoever, who would then use those to pay for services from other people. And people would build up stores of gold coin, silver coin, in order to be able to then sort of become wealthy. Coins are very much like that. They're not a liability to the bank. And this is an important distinction to me. If I issue a note as a bank, then effectively what I'm doing is I'm issuing an IOU to you. I'm issuing a note which says, I will repay this balance to you on demand, or in 90 days, or whatever the terms of the account is. But it's not sort of something which is an asset, is a liability of the bank. Coins, once you sell them, they are yours irrevocably. They can't be taken away unless somebody comes and sequesters them in some way, so through court proceedings. So you can transfer them as you wish to, whereas a bank deposit is reliant upon the bank acknowledging transfer of the debt, which of course is a legal concept. It's something which says that sort of if you try and transfer a debt to somebody else, then you have to have permission of that person to transfer that debt. So that becomes a multiple person sort of contract. Whereas with a coin, I give you a coin, the coin belongs to you, that's it, that's the end of it. So they're not returnable, they're not repayable, they exist because of their intrinsic value. And the intrinsic value in this case is, when it started with the Bitcoin, etc., was that the intrinsic value was the recording on the ledger. It was the recording that you owned this particular sort of part of the ledger, without assigning a monetary or other value to it. So Bitcoin, everybody says, its shortcoming is that it doesn't have anything backing it, but actually it did have something backing it. It had the sort of recording of that sort of ownership on the ledger. What we're now talking about, of course, is central bank digital currencies, which is basically taking ownership of part of a debt of the government to you, basically. Or we have stable coins, which are taking a ownership of a debt which sits in a bank's balance sheet. And then that allows you, using the token or coin, to transfer ownership of that debt to a third party without having necessarily to get their permission. Now that's, again, a fundamentally different concept. But what it does do is it means that sort of you move away from the existing financial model, which is about leverage, where in order to create a settlement, I create a loan, and that loan then settles the debts with a third party through a clearing bank or through a Federal Reserve or some other sort of central bank. And we move towards something where we can create something which represents real value with a real ownership underneath it, which then allows you to move to a different type of quantitative control of assets rather than a price control of assets. In conventional monetary theory today, the control of assets is by the price and by quantitative controls. Now, PBOC, for example, will say, you've got to give us 10% of all your deposits and hold those with the Reserve Bank and hold those with the central bank. They will then also say, and if you want to borrow reserves from us, we will charge you this interest rate. And that interest rate will then determine the price of money in the economy. Before that quantitative model came into existence, and largely speaking, it's the model that the Swiss, for example, control. It was more about quantitative. We will only mint this number of coins, or we will only create this number of banknotes, and those are absolute limits. Although, of course, that's disappeared recently as the US government, for example, has increasingly sort of increased its note issue without sort of, and it's become like a rubber stamp that they go to Congress and say, can we print another $1 trillion worth of dollars? And the Congress just simply stamps it and says, yes, you can print another $1 trillion worth of dollars. And then that $1 trillion worth of dollars is then issued, and then everybody uses them for transferring wealth. That's a modern construct. That's only really been around since the 1980s. Prior to that, it was very much quantitative, which is, here is the amount of notes in issue, and that's the amount that is authorized, and anything beyond that is not permitted. So it's a difference in way in which and largely speaking, that's what's given rise to this world that we live in now, where governments are undermining the value of their currencies by just increasing the amount of note issue, without having the same amount of issuance, the same amount of increase in the economy. So you have 3% increase in gross domestic product, but you have 15% increase in note issue. The two things don't really match up unless there's some change in the speed and velocity of circulation. So we're moving to a world which is much more sort of distributed. We're moving to a world in which quantitative measures will apply in terms of systems and controls. We will only mint this number of coins. But the issue, of course, is who controls this? Who's in control? Is it the commercial banks? Is it government? Is it corporations? Is it people? And that's, I think, the big sort of philosophical battleground that we're on right now. The central banks very clearly don't like the idea of the commercial banks being disintermediated by tokenization. So they're increasingly trying to force a model on the marketplace where the commercial banks are the intermediators of tokens, and you can't create your own tokens independently of that model. Equally, central banks are looking at central bank digital currencies, but they're worried about the level of competition that may create for the commercial banks. Because in a crisis, for example, why would you hold a commercial bank debt when you can hold a central bank debt? You would always hold central bank debt in a crisis. So you get a risk issue around liquidity at that point. And that's sort of fundamental to the debate that's taking place around central bank digital currencies at the moment, and taking place about stable coins at the moment. And different central banks have got different answers to that. The People's Bank of China clearly is looking to the banks to intermediate. The Bank of England is less so, and the Bank of Venezuela, of course, is going all the way and allowing people to create completely disintermediated some models of financial settlement. So you've got a gradation which is based upon sort of the structure and nature of regulation in the country control. So when the professor talks about currency wars, this is, I think, what he's describing. This conflicts between different countries in terms of their attitude towards the way in which currency is used and moved. And that will affect the technical infrastructure and the technical way in which one does that. But it's all about political control at the end of the day. It's all about political and commercial control. So the public policy challenges are very clear, which is credit creation has been the major engine of growth since the 1980s in most of the Western world, and probably the Eastern world as well, given that the Eastern world has been providing the goods and services to the Western world. So what happened in the 1980s was we had a dismantling of exchange controls in many countries. We had a opening up of the credit markets. For example, in the UK, banks previously were not allowed to lend money for real estate, but then they were allowed to lend money for real estate. And we saw a massive growth in things like derivatives contracts and other things, which allowed leverage to build into the system. And of course, the leverage has an impact on the real world in that it allows people to feel richer. You borrow lots of money, you buy bigger houses, and you feel very rich because you've got a bigger house. But of course, the fact is that sort of, if the whole thing comes to a halt, as it did, for example, in 2008, then you can quickly feel quite poor as well. So you get a lot of volatility in the marketplace, volatility in the economy. So the central banks are very keen to try and work out how to control that credit creation that might take place in this world, this new world. They've been anyway trying to de-emphasize credit creation since the 2008 crash, because that effectively sort of meant that central banks A had to write an unlimited check to support the banking sector. B, governments had to write to involve taxpayers' money in support of the banking sector, which was politically unattractive. And that's now sort of led to a deleveraging in terms of, for example, banks having to restrict their balance sheet growth to say 40 times their assets, their liabilities, something like that, in order to be able to control the rate of credit creation and to prevent the system from becoming unstable once more. And we know a number of economies around the world which are still very reliant on, for example, real estate and credit creation to drive growth, or credit creation for large infrastructure projects to drive growth. These things are clearly part of the system, and it's not unlike a heroin addict trying to reduce the reliance of a heroin addict on heroin. Credit creation makes people feel good. It makes people feel good about their governments. People vote for their governments because they feel good. It's not a good story to try and sort of change that. Now, the beauty of DeFi, I believe, is that and this is my own belief, is that you can gradually wean the system off this system of leverage, and you can then begin to focus again back onto real assets, onto real ownership. So instead of me borrowing money to buy a house, I can actually exchange ownership of some future liability, for example, with somebody in order to get ownership of a house, or I can sort of exchange a promise with somebody else through a token, or I can exchange a token which has got real intrinsic value like gold or silver or something else which is backing it. I can take my home, for example, and I can put it into a token, and I can then offer you the right to have part of my home, and I'll pay you rent, for example, on that over life. So there are multiple different models which can come out of the DeFi world, which will allow people to change the way in which they behave and change the reliance on leverage. And in doing so, also reduce the need for regulation, because at the end of the day, sort of, we're only using regulation or the amount of regulation we have today because the system became unstable, because the system was uncontrollable. So regulation increased as a result of that. If we move back to where people are making decisions for themselves and they're taking risk decisions for themselves, in Latin, the word is caveat emptor, which is let the buyer beware, then essentially what we end up with is a different sort of economic model, which is less volatile, stronger, and easier to manage from a policy point of view than this very highly centralized, highly leveraged model that we currently have. And that's not a popular thing to be thinking, but I think it's something which the technology would enable. And I think from that point of view, we can create a different type of economy sort of off the back of that. So we can create assets which are bundled and unbundled at will. We can use those smart contracts or whatever other constructs we come up with to do that. We already did that sort of in the 1980s with derivatives and so on, where we sort of unbundled interest rates, we unbundled credit in the form of credit derivative swap and so on. We can do the same now with real assets. We can change the nature of assets and how those assets are used. And they can be aggregated into different types of stable coin, for example. So you can have a stable coin which is linked to commercial real estate. You can have a stable coin which is linked to leases on cars. There are a number of different things which you can do. And in consequence, those of us who have an interest in maintaining the value of our assets over our lifetimes to fund our liabilities, particularly things like pensions and so on, can create our own pension pots, our own way of hedging future volatility in the world, and manage that sort of volatility ourselves in a way which is where we're taking decisions for ourselves, but where fundamentally the current model of intermediation becomes less important, at least from an intermediation transactional point of view. We may still need to have advice from people. We may still need to pay people who understand trends in economic performance, etc., to give us sound guidance. But what we won't be able to have to do is to spend a lot of money sort of paying for transactional intermediation of assets going forward. The current banking model means that essentially we're paying a very, very high price for intermediation. I take my savings, lend it to the bank lends it to somebody else. The cost of that, so that in terms of the bank, is very high. Most banks operate at, for example, a cost-income ratio of greater than 60%. So that gets directly passed back to me as a consumer. It gets passed back to you as a consumer. If we move to a DeFi world, that sort of begins to erode significantly, and we can therefore reduce the cost of transactions. If we reduce the cost of transactions, it becomes easier for people to invest. It becomes easier for people to come up with new models, and we get innovation. And with that innovation, we get growth, and we get sort of something which is different to the world that we live in today. So that's my hypothesis. But what it does mean is sort of we become less dependent upon regulation. We become more dependent upon individual decision. We become more dependent upon having good information, having good technology, having good understanding of the risks that we're incurring in this new world. So that's my short presentation. But I hopefully what it will do is that it will get people to focus on those risks. They'll start thinking about how the world has changed. The providers that we're talking about today, Facebook, for example, continues to try and remain relevant, even though they're being replaced by Instagram. Instagram will be replaced by something else, and that will be replaced by something else. And we can see the cycles are declining time and time again. The big companies of the past, like General Electric and so on, are now no longer sort of the big companies of the past. And the same will be true in the future of these other companies. Capital controls and other political risks will remain. Governments won't get on with each other. They'll try and restrict the flow of capital. They'll try and restrict ownership rights of people they don't like. And we'll have to try and find a way of negotiating around those things. But in terms of financial crime and so on, we'll actually have greater transparency. We'll have greater understanding of the knowledge of where the transactions are. If I put money into a bank today, nobody knows that the other side of the world, it was me that put the money in the bank. All they can see is the bank's name. In the DeFi world, it's absolutely clear who owns what assets. So if a criminal starts accruing assets which he doesn't own or has no right to, then essentially that becomes very clear. And from a financial crime point of view, you can then focus on those people. But to be able to be part of this world, we all have to have our own digital identity. Going back to that whole question of identity, identity becomes key to understanding how we sort of bring these different elements together and how we manage those elements going forward. So that's me. So I'm very happy to take any questions.
So based on, I have a question, Bob.
Please do.
Based on you're talking about this, you mentioned about this credit system, how
Yes.
it impacts the economic in the past century, I would say that. So now if we change to your trust model and this payment distributed process, you think that that credit system will be impacted and then people will get more credit?
I think what it will do is it will change the dynamics of. So at the moment we're really heavily dependent upon the credit system for growth. And for example, in China, sort of something like 70% of the money that banks create goes to the state-owned entities to allow those state entities to continue to employ lots of people and to manage projects, etc. That's
Okay.
many people would believe is not sustainable in the medium term. If you move to a token-based system where there's a real transfer of value, a deleveraged model, then people will only pay for the things which they truly value. Right. I think the problem is that we've lost the concept of value in today's world.